I'd like to share with you a well-known Buddhist teaching story. It's a painful tale, but it illustrates the importance and the universal truth about the value of connecting with others. It's said that in the time of the Buddha, there was a woman who was nearly psychotic with grief because she had lost her only living son. And she was carrying his lifeless body, wailing, wandering around the village, asking for help. And her friends and neighbors, they felt it a total loss. They felt her pain, but didn't know what to do. Until one gentleman suggested that she go over to the next valley where a great teacher was camped out with his followers. So she did so. She went over there, and in the next valley, she found the Buddha surrounded by his monks. She spoke to some of the monks and explained her situation and said, "Might I have a meeting with the great teacher?" And they arranged it, and she came and met with him. And she said, "I can't bear this. I just can't bear to be without my son. Can you possibly help me? Can you bring him back to life?" And the Buddha said, "Well, I think I can help." And she said, tell me, what do I need to do?" And he said, "Here's what you need to do. I need you to go back to the village and go to a neighbor's house and get from them a mustard seed, and then bring that mustard seed back to me." And mustard seeds in the days of the Buddha were extremely common. They would like salt and pepper or flour might be in a modern Western home. And she said, certainly, I'll go right away." And as she turned to leave, he said, "Just one more thing. Just make sure when you get the mustard seed that you get it from a house where people are not suffering from some kind of a loss." She says, okay, I'll go. And she heads off to do that. She comes back to the village and goes to the first neighbor's house, knocks on the door. The neighbor opens the door. She tells her story, and they're of course moved and willing to get the mustard seed right away. They come back with the mustard seed, and she says, oh, just one thing. I have to ask you, are you suffering here because of some sort of loss? And the gentleman says, well, sort of. Our nephew, you see, he went off to town several days ago, and he was supposed to just transact some business and come right home. But he hasn't come home yet, and this isn't like him. He's a responsible young man. So we're worried that perhaps he was beset by bandits. She thanked him and went on to the next house. At the next house, knocks again, tells her tale again. They come, they bring a mustard seed. She asks her question. They say, oh, well, you see, it's my aunt. She's actually here in the back room right now, and the doctor came yesterday, and he's not sure what's wrong, but he doesn't think she's going to last very long. We're really quite distressed about this. And this is how the story unfolds. She goes from household to household. In each household, she receives a mustard seed, and in each household, she receives a story. And it's said that at the end of her rounds, after she had visited all of the houses in the village, she went back to the Buddha and said, "Thank you. I think I'm beginning to understand." And as the tale goes, she went on to become a great teacher in her own right. Now, much of our psychological distress, and actually many clinical disorders, are either caused or exacerbated by our sense that we're alone with it, or that the problem itself marks us as defective, perhaps even unfit to participate in the human family. And this can happen from anything from like being the victim of sexual or physical abuse to even struggling with anxiety or depression. It's one reason why therapy groups can be so effective in helping people to deal with their difficulties. It helps us to not feel so alone. Luckily, mindfulness practices can also help to ease our sense of isolation. Now, there's a problem in consumer economies generally, because the way in which we sell things to one another is by promising, in essence, if you buy my product or use my service, you're going to be happier. Now, other kinds of economies have their own difficulties, but this is a difficulty we certainly experience in ours. And one of the results of this is we think if we're not happy, it's our fault. After all, when I'm marketing my own presentations that I do for mental health professionals, or even when the folks are marketing this course, the idea is if you have this experience, you're going to feel better. that's naturally how we sell things to one another. But then if we find we're not happy, that becomes a real problem. And we start to think, I must have done something wrong. For example, if I'm watching, say, a Pepsi commercial, and everybody is smiling and laughing and playing volleyball on the beach, and that's not my experience, I, in essence, feel, what's wrong? I should have bought Pepsi instead of Coke, right? Or worse, if we did make the so-called right choice, then we think it's some kind of inherent weakness. And this extends to things far beyond buying consumer products. We start to think, if only I had chosen a different spouse, if only I had chosen a different career, if only I was living in a different part of the world, then I'd be happy. It must be my fault that I've made a mistake like this. And our psychiatric diagnostic system, unfortunately, just exacerbates the problem. We tend to think that if people are suffering, it must be because they're sick. And if you looked at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that we use for diagnoses, it covers absolutely everything a human being might experience. So this emphasis on individuality, as well as this emphasis on trying to acquire happiness, tends to create loneliness and alienation. We feel a kind of chronic disconnection, and it results in a kind of loss of energy and meaning for a lot of people, all sorts of negative self-images. Think about what it was like as a kid. For so many of us, if we were alone on a Saturday night and we assumed everybody else was out of the party, the thought processes goes to, what's wrong with me? Am I unlikable? Am I unlovable? Now, historically, religious belief and participation in religious groups helped us to feel more connected. But that seems to be declining in modern cultures. In the United States, for example, in 1950, only 2% of the population self-reported that they were religiously unaffiliated. By 2010, it was up to 16% of the population. And by 2012, if we look at younger people between the age of 18 and 39, 32% of the population says that they're unaffiliated. People no longer have these natural senses of connection to community that we once had. So how might mindfulness help us with this? Well, we've discussed already how it can help to generate empathy and compassion, and those both help us to support intimate relationships. In this lecture, we're going to explore further how to use mindfulness and compassion practices to facilitate communication and connection, as well as to facilitate the capacity to be alone, which, as we'll see, is really necessary for being able to feel connected to others and connected to the wider world. Now, there's a school of psychology called relational cultural theory that grew out of dissatisfaction with the prevailing models that we had. And it came from a feminist critique, and it was started at Wellesley College. There's a center for psychology of women there. And it was the work of Jean Baker Miller, Irene Stiver. Many of you may know Carol Gilligan's work. She wrote a very well-known book called In a Different Voice about how girls really are different in the world than boys. And what they focused on here were the benefits of mutual connection rather than focusing on individual autonomy and individuation. And at the Stone Center, they identified several different benefits of mutual connection. That when people are connected to one another, they experience more energy and vitality. They have a greater capacity to act. They have increased clarity. The words they use, they say enhanced self-worth, but I would say enhanced self-efficacy, the feeling that I can handle life's challenges. And there's a natural desire and capacity for more connection that comes out of this. Now, one of my friends and colleagues, Jan Surrey, has suggested a way that we can use mindfulness practice to develop just this sense of connection. And she suggests that in our mindfulness practice, when we're with another human being, we try being aware of 3 objects of awareness. First, I could be mindful of the sensations, thoughts, and feelings that are happening in me, as we normally do as we've been doing meditation practices. Then I can be mindful of the words, body language, and the mood of the other, of whoever I'm with at the moment. And then I can be mindful of the flow of relationship. Now let me explain this last part because it's a little bit tricky. We don't usually think about this so much. The best way I can illustrate this is from what happens very often in couples therapy. Many, many psychotherapists have had this example. And if I can use a kind of conventional heterosexual couple, typically what happens is it was the woman's idea to come into treatment. And she's sitting there with her husband, and she's really at her wit's end. And she's saying to her husband, honey, I just hate it. Every time I have some kind of difficult emotional experience and want to communicate with you, you disappear. And the husband, really feeling quite confused, turns to his wife and says, but sweetheart, I'm sitting right next to you. And the woman can't believe it. She rolls her eyes and she just says, I don't mean you disappear geographically, you ninny. I mean you disappear emotionally. And the husband says, but I'm here with you, honey. I'm listening. And they have this disconnect because he really doesn't know what she's talking about. She's talking about this felt sense of connection or disconnection, and he doesn't really have a good nuanced sense of what that's even about in a relationship. When we do mindfulness practice and we become aware of what's happening in me, what's happening in you, and this felt sense of connection or disconnection, we tend to be able to adjust the relationship that when there's more of a sense of disconnection to finding a way to come back together. Now, there's a very powerful mindfulness exercise that's being used in recent years. It's not one that comes out of the Buddhist traditions. It's really a Western innovation called breathing together. And the full practice is available for you as an audio recording included with the course, and I very much encourage you to try it. What you do in this practice is, ideally, you do it with another person. And it can be somebody who you know well or somebody you don't know so well. Perhaps it's somebody who's watching the course with you and has had some meditation experience at this point. Now, if you don't have the opportunity to do it with a physically present partner, it can still be done with a mental image of the other. You can simply call to mind another person who matters to you that you'd like to do this with. This is the way the practice works. You're going to begin by practicing meditation, a breath-focused practice, facing one another with the eyes closed. And simply notice the feelings that arise and pass. And the instructions for this are on the audio recording. What most of us notice is that it feels differently to us to be with our breath, simply knowing that there's another human being across from us being with his or her breath. And then what we do is we open the eyes a little bit, and we look at the other person's midsection or belly, just so that we can see the other person's breathing. And we try being with our own breathing as we notice the other breathing. That can be quite powerful, simply to feel that we're in this together. Then finally, and you'll be guided for this step by step in the audio recording, we start to go through the lifespan together, to consider our own experience and the experience of the other person, beginning as a baby, wholly dependent on others, and having good fortunes and bad fortunes. Because, of course, we all have good fortunes and bad fortunes at every stage in our development. And we go all the way through the life cycle, going through school, graduating, entering into family life, and all the way to the end of life. And as we do this together, we start to notice that, gosh, every one of us has in common joys and sorrows, victories and defeats at every stage and at every transition. I invite you to try this exercise because it can be very powerful. It's being used a lot in couples therapy these days, although you don't have to do it with somebody you're intimately involved with. It can be done with a friend or even an acquaintance. I often do it with groups, and it can be done with a stranger and be quite moving. Usually what comes up is a kind of sadness about mortality, because we go through the whole life cycle and realize we're all in this together. But then an appreciation for the fact that we're all in this together. We all very much have in common this experience of birth, of going through so many joys and sorrows at every single developmental stage. And we start to notice how the way in which we understand other people is by connecting with what happened to us at those stages. In the Buddhist tradition, they talk about the 10,000 joys and sorrows as being the experience of living a life. Now, this sort of interpersonal connection fosters awareness of what we might call interbeing. That's Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen master's word for this connection to something larger than ourselves. And we experience interbeing on many levels. It could be being part of a family, part of a neighborhood, part of the natural and human world. And it's a natural consequence of seeing ourselves clearly, as we've spoken about before, noticing that this is simply an impermanent, ever-changing process that's wholly interconnected with the environment, part of the superorganism of other human beings and even the larger ecological system. Now, Aldous Huxley used to talk about the perennial philosophy, because this sense of interbeing has been noticed by human beings from time immemorial. In theistic terms, it's very often described as everything being part of God or everything being part of the divine. In non-theistic terms, it's seen much more in terms of everything being part of a universe of matter and energy, atoms and molecules, or an ecological system, or the natural world. Now, what many people have noticed, Huxley among them, and religious mystics throughout the ages, is that our narrative word-based thought tends to obscure this reality. The fact that we're living in the thought stream, what we're noticing through mindfulness practice, that most of the time we're simply living in this narrative about me and narrative about what I want, that it actually, the words are what obscure the reality of interbeing or interconnectedness. Now, some people have even interpreted the Genesis story, the story of the Garden of Eden, as being about this. Because in that story, Adam and Eve wind up eating of the tree of knowledge, right? And what is the tree of knowledge? The tree of knowledge is about learning to distinguish good from evil, and in essence, separating this from that, to be able to say, this is me, that's you. That's a tree, that's a frog. And in developing language for the separate objects in our experience, we lose awareness of interbeing. One of the things that happens through mindfulness practice, and you may not notice this initially, you need some depth of practice to get this, is as the thought stream starts to become less and less relevant, we actually feel in a moment-to-moment way the interconnectedness of all things. When this first happened to me, I remember, it was probably when I was in college, and I remember walking across campus, and I know this may sound peculiar, but it was as though there was no separation from what I thought of as my mind and the experience of the interconnected larger universe. It was as though walking through the trees, walking through the pathways was like walking through my own mind. And this sense of interconnection, which mystics from various traditions have identified with their own cultural language, is what becomes available to us with mindfulness practice. And it gives us a profound sense of connecting to the larger world and to one another. Now, connecting to others and suffering together is central to all relational healing, to medicine, to the ministry, to parenting, even to marriage and friendship. And appreciating the impersonal and universal quality of pain is part of how we do this. Because what we need to learn how to do is to open to the other's pain as we open to our own in suffering together. That's what happened in the story of the mustard seed. That's the power of therapy groups. There's even a form of interpersonal mindfulness practice called insight dialogue that was developed by a fellow named Gregory Kramer, who had many years of meditation practice, which is entirely about different exercises that are like the breathing together exercise, in which we simply see all of our practice as an interpersonal practice. There are many studies of the effects of mindfulness on relationships, and no surprise, they help. Qualities of marriage were reportedly improved with mindfulness training. It was adapted to couples therapy. People had improved stress coping skills, and they were able to handle difficulties in a way where it didn't devolve into a fight so easily. And mindfulness also improved day-to-day ratings of marital closeness and satisfaction. It even works well for divorce. I have 3 friends that I've taught with on a number of occasions. And they're named Bill Morgan, Stephanie Morgan, and Susan Morgan. And when they're introduced, or when they show up on the brochure advertising the program, people are often curious, how did we wind up with 3 Morgans? Well, here's the story. Bill used to be married to Stephanie, and they were married for many years, and they ran into difficulties, as often happens, and they decided to separate, and then eventually to divorce. And it was a difficult period. They were both part of this group of people that I mentioned a while ago that for 30 years have been investigating mindfulness and psychotherapy in the Boston area. And for a little while, they weren't able to both participate in the group at the same time. They would alternate. But they were both very serious about this mindfulness practice, and they were actually able to work with the difficult feelings about the divorce in such a way that they saw it as their own issues rather than all about being the other person's fault. Eventually, Stephanie remarried, Bill remarried somebody who is now Susan Morgan. And the three of them are actually good friends and are able to interact with one another. Now, that can happen outside of mindfulness practice, but I think it's an illustration of the power of these practices to help people to step out of their immediate desires, out of their narratives about selfing, and just see the whole picture and tolerate difficult feelings as they arise that allow them to have this kind of relationship together. Other formal studies show that mindfulness skills enhance relationships, in part by helping us to differentiate the experience of emotion from the enactment of emotion. This involves having a moment to take a breath before reacting. You may have noticed in your own relationships that almost all the times when things go wrong, it's because a feeling arises and we immediately act on it and express something. And oftentimes, it just throws gasoline on the flames and things get worse. And we're only able to do this, to not immediately express it, if we have the capacity for increased affect tolerance, the ability to be run through with the sword without blinking an eye. And being able to bear one another's upset feeling as well as our own is critical for this. Now, the other thing that we get from mindfulness practice is we simply become aware of this full range of emotional experience, which is so important for empathy. We talked about the insula activation that's involved in this earlier. And it enables us to feel the mirror neuron activation and the awareness of the effects of the emotional exchange on the relationship. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that mindfulness practice allows us to do is actually allows us to be alone. And we don't often think about this in the modern world, but solitude can be a very, very powerful tool for not only for developing our own awareness and appreciation of interbeing, but for connecting us to others. The tendency for I, me, mine is actually dissolved somewhat in experiences of solitude. I remember visiting Athens a number of years ago, and in the Agora, the marketplace, they had an exhibit of ostrakhan. Now, ostrakhan were these pottery shards on which a person's name was written down in ancient Greece if they had to leave the community, if they were going to be ostracized. And it was used in ancient Greece to try to regulate society and regulate people's social behavior. Basically, if you violated the rules, you were out. Now, paleontologists suspect that this custom goes way, way back because they find isolated campsites outside of the main settlement in prehistoric times. And the assumption is these were folks who themselves were ostracized early on. And this may well be hardwired among us. After all, we're social primates. We evolved in groups and tribes and bands. And when we're part of a group or a band or a tribe, to be separated from that group can be quite threatening. This is in part because we needed one another to survive in a hostile environment. Now, many of us also live in urban environments where we have few moments without interpersonal stimulation, so being alone can bring up all sorts of difficult feelings for us. It can be quite disorienting. I mentioned the problem of being alone on Saturday night as a teenager. Sometimes being alone means feeling like a loser, feeling that, well, lovable people, they're not alone, only losers, only rejects are alone. And when we're alone, self can feel very, very threatened, in part because we think of ourselves as having been ostracized from the human family. It's also difficult because we know from child development that it's actually contact with others that provides our sense of emotional regulation. We use others to modulate our moods when we're having a hard time. It helps us to create our sense of identity, and while Buddhist psychology is interested in dismantling that, most of us are kind of attached to our identity, thinking, oh, I'm Ron, I'm a psychologist, I'm a dad, those kinds of things. I tend to cling to them. And it means the other provides the protection of the primate troop or the human group. Now, in the modern day, many people are never alone because they never take any time without the television, cell phone, my iPod. I'm busily texting, emailing, or perhaps playing video games and interacting with other imaginary figures in that way. And this actually robs us from an opportunity to develop quite a lot of important skills. Now, most religions have recognized that solitude has enormous potential for spiritual development. And here, I'm going to look across many different religious traditions and say that one common thread in spiritual development is this appreciation of interbeing. And we see almost all traditions have hermits and monks and nuns or wandering ascetics, all of whom remove themselves from the hubbub of daily life in order to, in essence, experience interbeing. And in doing this, they go through phases in which they face loneliness. Most serious inner explorers have had deep loneliness. They come face to face with feelings of being unloved, of being alone, realizing that this life cycle is impermanent, that death is coming, and realizing that in a certain way it's meaningless, that meaning is socially constructed. And we see this in the stories of Jesus, of Lao Tzu, of the Buddha. They all went off alone to find paths to well-being. Here's what's written about some of them. This is about Jesus from Matthew. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was alone. And it said that he spent 40 days and 40 nights alone. And what it says in Mark is, and he was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels ministered to him. We'll see that the same theme occurs with other great spiritual leaders. Lao Tzu said, ordinary men hate solitude, but the master makes use of it, embracing his aloneness, realizing he is one with the whole universe. And the Buddha is said to also have gone into solitary meditation under the Bodhi tree for some 49 days and nights. Apparently 40 meant a very long time in the axial age when both the Buddha and Jesus lived. And it said that that's where he attained enlightenment. And what he said was, I will not leave this spot until I find an end to suffering. And under the Bodhi tree, what's reported is he said this, having tasted the sweetness of inner solitude and calmness, he who lives by the Dharma, the natural law, is free from fear and suffering. Now we see this in radical forms in the Tibetan tradition. There's this tradition of going off into a hut and living completely isolated for many years. And here's what a woman, Alexandra David Neal, who in 1924 went from England to study with the Tibetan Lamas, here's what she said. She said, words cannot convey the almost voluptuous sweetness of the feelings experienced when one closes the door of one's Sams Kang, that's the hermitage hut, or when one looks down from the heights at the first wintry snow heaping upon the lower valleys, creating for months around the hermitage an impassable white and cold rampart. Now, we can even have this experience in the course of our ordinary meditation practice. There's this tradition of noble silence, which is not talking to others, not making eye contact, not doing all of the various things we do to interact. And I can tell you from my own experience in retreat that even though we're among other people, having this solitude gives a profound sense of interconnection and as well as connection to one's own experience. And these experiences open up of really feeling part of interbeing. Now, loneliness is quite different from solitude. When we're lonely, we're longing for contact, and we see our aloneness as a mark of failure. We think we're the only one. We feel vulnerable and unloved. And loneliness is usually imposed, not chosen. Solitude, on the other hand, is about valuing being with oneself, choosing it, recognizing that it's part of our common humanity. Mindfulness, by reducing the self-focus and increasing our interest and curiosity and awareness of interbeing, supports solitude over loneliness. It makes it so that when we're alone, we're much more likely to experience it as solitude than as loneliness. Now, our capacity for solitude is very important for intimacy. Because if I can't be with me alone, I'm not going to be able to be with you. We've all seen this in relationships. You see it somewhat more in younger people, but it can happen when we're older as well. If I feel like I desperately need to be with you to feel okay, then as soon as we have some kind of disharmony, as soon as you're not quite with me or you're angry with me, I collapse and I have a desperate need to make you be different. And I don't have the flexibility to really listen to what's going on. In fact, this kind of desperation can sometimes lead to power imbalances where one person will basically give away more and more of his or her rights in the relationship just because they're so desperate not to be left. Solitude, at its most gratifying, connects us to the world outside of ourselves. And by removing the moorings of identity that we usually get in our social life, we actually have the option of seeing our part in the larger world. And this connects us to the big picture. So I ask you to take a moment to reflect on what connects you to the big picture. What helps you to identify with something larger than yourself? Is it nature? Is it friends and family and community? Perhaps is it time with a spiritual teacher, somebody who's so interconnected him or herself that just being in their presence brings up this feeling for you? Or is it connection to a religious figure or tradition, Jesus, the Buddha, Mohammed, Moses, Lao Tzu? And what activities help you feel connected to something larger than yourself? Is it prayer? Have you found this yet through meditation or mindfulness practice? Or perhaps spending time in nature, talking with a friend, hugging an animal, reading scripture, producing art? We want to inquire and notice what helps us so that when we're in solitude, we have this experience of interbeing. And when we can be with ourselves, then we can really be with others. Because if I can tolerate my own experience, then whatever happens in you, I can both be there with and for you. As Paul Tillich put it, 1 hour of solitude may bring us closer to those we love than many hours of communication. So in our next lecture, we're going to talk about connecting with a particular type of person, children and adolescents. Thanks for being here.